Hello, I'm Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special economic weather report brought to you in association with the BNZ. And frankly, today is going to be an economic version of Advance Australia Fair, because we've got some new figures from Australia showing just how strong their economy is and just how lucky we are to be right next to the lucky country. Australia's GDP grew 0.9% in the December quarter from the September quarter, and it's actually up 2.7% from a year ago. Australia was one of those very lucky countries that avoided recession during the global financial crisis, unlike us. And it kept growing largely because of its close connection to China, which is still growing strongly. Many people from the rest of the world look on New Zealand in a different way than we look on ourselves. Frankly, they don't care much about New Zealand and they don't know much about it, yet they make big decisions about whether they should lend us money. And these are the decisions and the views we have to care about. And luckily for us right now, they see New Zealand as intimately connected to Australia, and that Australia is intimately connected to China. And they're pretty right. About 25% of our exports go to Australia at the moment. The big three, and these are a bit of a surprise, are petroleum. We export oil to Australia, which is then refined there. Gold, we export that from Otago and the Coromandel to Australia, which is then refined. And wine, where of course our wine is better than the Australian wine and they drink our wine there too. And then of course tourists. Australian tourists come here and spend a lot of money, and they're coming here in increasing numbers, up 16% in January, because we're cheap, we're easy and we look great. All those fantastic mountains and water, which they don't obviously have. So we're very lucky to be right next to Australia, not just because their economy is doing well and we're benefiting from that, but because we have the same banks. And Australia's banks have frankly been the strongest in the world in the last 3 or 4 years. The regulation has been strong, the capital has been strong, and whether it's luck or not, they've managed to avoid doing all the bad things that the Northern Hemisphere banks did. Australia is also has relatively low debts compared to the rest of the world. Its net foreign debt is about 50% of GDP. That's much lower than for many other countries. Ours is actually closer to 100% and set to go well over 100% in the next few years. And if we were Greece or Iceland or Ireland, we'd probably be being jumped on right now by the world's financial markets. But because we're right next to Australia, we're fine. Or at least that's fine for right now. Our unemployment rate is actually higher than Australia, and we saw Australia increase its official cash rate this week to 4%. We're still stuck at 2.5%. Luckily for us, we have an adjustable currency, which means that our New Zealand dollar is falling against the Australian dollar. Again, great for our exporters and for our tourist operators. And when you look too at the future for Australia, on the face of it, it looks great. We saw a speech in the last week from the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Rick Battolino. It's worth looking at. Under this video, you'll be able to see a link to it. It's well worth reading because he puts the mining boom in Australia right now in the context of previous mining booms. It turns out this is the biggest mining boom in Australia's history, or at least for more than 100 years. The spike in prices is bigger since the wool price spike in the early 1950s, when the American Army were busy buying wool to buy uniforms for the Korean War. And when you look at the share of investment in mining going into Australia, it's the biggest seen ever. The share of contribution to GDP from mining in Australia is the biggest since the 1890s. And that makes it easier for us to sell the story. We're connected to Australia, Australia's connected to China, and we're fine. And that helps us sell our bonds overseas. Just imagine if you're a bond buyer in Hong Kong, New York, or London, you're probably 28 years old, you don't know much about New Zealand. All you need to be told is, we're connected to Australia, Australia's connected to China, no worries. But can it last? Because Australia's debts, particularly of the household sector, is quite high. They also have a housing bubble. And of course, they're relying on China, which is why we all need to watch what's happening in China very closely. They have their own problems there, particularly with inflationary pressures, their own credit bubble in housing, and the question is, can they maintain it? Because of China, of course, depends on consumption in America. And right now, the Americans aren't consuming much at all. They're saving as fast as they can to pay back their debts. So the question is, will it be sustained? Is Australia vulnerable, and are we therefore vulnerable in the coming years to some sort of slowdown? At the moment it seems like we're fine, but we have to be a little bit careful, and we need to be watching China in particular, because right now Australia is a province of China and we're a suburb of Australia. I'm Hickey. That was a special economic weather report brought to you in association with the BNZ, which is owned by the Australian Bank, National Australia Bank.